The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping beside me. I kept my eyes closed. I slowed my breathing. I wanted them to think I was asleep. My children stood near my bed. I could feel their presence. Their silence felt heavy. Then one of them whispered, very softly, "After this, everything changes." My heart trembled, but I did not move. Another voice answered, "We just have to wait." Wait for what? I lay there, still and silent. They thought I could not hear, but I heard every word. Before I tell you what happened next, let me take a quiet moment to welcome you. Thank you for being here with me today. It means more than you know. If stories like this touch your heart, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps the space grow. Here, we share real stories, stories about family, about love, about mistakes, and about quiet strength. Now, let me take you back to the life I built. I was not always lying in a hospital bed. Once, I was the kind of woman who woke before the sun. The house would still be dark, the world would still be quiet, and I would already be moving. I built my life around my children. When they were little, mornings were loud, small feet running across the hallway, cereal spilling on the table, school bags half open. I remember tying shoelaces, wiping faces, packing lunches with little notes inside. "Have a good day. Mom loves you." Those notes were simple, but I meant every word. Their father, my husband, used to stand in the doorway and smile. He would sip his coffee slowly. He liked watching the chaos. He used to say, "This is what a full house sounds like." Back then, I thought the noise would never end, but life has a quiet way of changing. My husband passed away 15 years ago. It was sudden, a heart attack, no warning. One day he was there, the next day he was not. I remember sitting at the kitchen table after the funeral, the same table where we had laughed so many times, but that day, it felt too big, too empty. My children were still young, not babies, but not grown either. They needed me. So I did not allow myself to fall apart. Not fully. I cried at night, softly, into my pillow. But in the morning, I stood up. I learned how to manage the bills alone. I learned how to fix small things around the house. I even took a part-time job at the local grocery store. It was not glamorous, but it paid for school supplies, for shoes, for birthday cakes. I never wanted my children to feel the weight of what we lost. I remember my son once asking, "Mom, are we going to be okay?" I knelt in front of him. I held his face in my hands. "Yes," I said, "we are going to be more than okay." And I believed it. We did not have much, but we had dinner together every night. And no phones, no television, just conversation. I would ask about their day. They would complain about homework. Sometimes we laughed. Sometimes we argued about small things. But we were together. On weekends, we cleaned the house as a team. Music playing softly from the old radio, dust floating in the sunlight. Those were good days. Simple days. I kept all their drawings, every report card, every handmade Mother's Day card. They used to write things like, "My mom is the best. My mom works very hard." I still have those papers in a box. Sometimes when the house felt too quiet, I would open that box and look at them. I was proud of them. Proud when they graduated high school. Proud when they went to college. Proud when they found jobs. I told everyone about their achievements, even strangers at the store. My daughter works in an office downtown. My son just got promoted. I said those words with joy, with pride. When they started earning their own money, I felt relief. I thought, now they can build their own lives. Now they are safe. They began visiting less often, but I understood. They were busy. Work, friends, relationships. That is how life goes. I never wanted to be the kind of mother who holds too tight. When my daughter got married, I helped her choose her dress. I stood beside her in the fitting room. She looked beautiful. She hugged me and said, "I couldn't have done this without you." I smiled, but inside, I felt something shift. She was building her own family now. My son moved to another city for work. He called every Sunday at first, then every other Sunday. Then sometimes he forgot, but when he did call, I acted cheerful. I'm fine, I would say. Don't worry about me. And most days that was true. I kept myself busy. I planted flowers in the garden. I joined a small church group. I learned to cook new recipes. I told myself this was the natural order of things. Children grow up. They move forward. Parents step back. Still, there were moments when I would sit at the dining table alone. 3 empty chairs around me. The house too silent. I would remember the sound of their laughter. The arguments about who took the last piece of bread. The way they used to run to me when they were scared. Back then, I was their safe place. I never imagined a time when I might not be. As the years passed, I began to rely on them in small ways. My son helped me with online banking. My daughter reminded me about doctor appointments. They said it was easier if one of them handled certain paperwork. Mom, you don't need to worry about this stuff anymore, my son said once. You've done enough. I believed him. Maybe I wanted to believe him. I trusted them completely. After all, I had given them everything I had, not because I expected something back, but because that is what love does. It gives, even when it is tired, even when it is afraid. I never kept score. If they were short on rent, I helped. If they needed advice, I listened. If they were upset, I comforted them. Even as adults, they would sometimes call me late at night. Mom, can I talk to you? And I would sit up in bed, lamp glowing beside me, listening. Because that is what mothers do. They listen. They hold space. They stay awake so their children can rest. I truly believed we were close. Not perfect, but close. I thought the foundation we built was strong enough to carry us through anything. I never imagined that one day I would lie in a hospital bed, pretending to sleep, while those same children whispered about what would happen after this. If you had asked me years ago whether my children would ever speak about me as if I were already gone, I would have laughed gently. Not mine. I would have said, because I raised them with love, and love, I thought, was enough. I did not know then that love can sometimes change shape, sometimes slowly, so slowly you barely notice, until one day you open your eyes or keep them closed and realize the room feels different, and so do the voices inside it. If I am honest, the change did not happen all at once. It was not a storm. It was not a loud argument. It was not a single moment I could point to and say, that was the beginning. It was quieter than that. It began with small things. Phone calls that grew shorter, visits that became less frequent, conversations that felt rushed. First, I told myself it was normal. Life moves fast. Work becomes demanding. Children grow into adults with their own responsibilities. I understood that. Or at least I tried to. My daughter used to come every Sunday afternoon. She would sit at the kitchen table. We would drink tea. She would tell me about her week. But then Sunday visits became once a month. Then once every few months, when I asked, gently, are you coming by this weekend? She would pause before answering, oh Mom, we're just so busy. Maybe next week. There was always a next week. My son's calls changed too. He still phoned, but his voice often sounded distracted. I could hear typing in the background, or the hum of traffic. Everything okay, Mom? He would ask quickly. Yes, I would say, everything is fine. And it usually was. But the conversations felt different, less open, less patient. Once, I tried telling him about a strange pain in my chest. It had lasted only a few minutes, but it frightened me. He responded gently, but with distance. You should probably see a doctor. Don't ignore that. I won't, I said. But he did not ask any more questions. He did not say, do you want me to come with you? And I did not ask him to. I did not want to be a burden. That word, burden. It began to visit my thoughts more often. When the sink leaked, I hesitated before calling my son. When my car made a strange noise, I almost convinced myself it was nothing. I began solving more problems on my own, not because I could not ask for help, but because I was afraid of the sigh on the other end of the phone, the polite impatience. One afternoon, My daughter came over unexpectedly. She looked tired, stressed. We sat in the living room. The television was off. The house felt still. She glanced around the room. You still have all this old furniture? She asked. I looked at the couch, the wooden cabinet, the framed photos. Yes, I said softly. I like it. She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. You should think about downsizing someday. This house is too much for you. Too much. For me, I had lived in that house for over 30 years. It held birthdays, Christmas mornings, tears and laughter, but suddenly, it sounded like a problem. I tried to laugh lightly. It's not too much, I said. I manage. She nodded, but I felt something unspoken between us. Later that week, my son called. Mom, have you updated your will recently? The question caught me off guard. My will, I repeated. Yes, it's important to keep those things current. I felt a small chill. I haven't thought about it in a while, I admitted. Well, he said carefully, it's just practical. You know, planning ahead. Planning ahead. I knew he meant well. At least, I hoped he did. But something about the timing felt strange. They had both mentioned the house within days of each other. I told myself I was overthinking. Children worry about their parents as they age. That is natural. Still, I began noticing more details. When they visited together, their conversations sometimes paused when I entered the room. They would exchange quick looks. Once, I walked into the kitchen and heard my daughter say, if we don't handle it soon, it'll be complicated. When she saw me, she smiled too quickly. Mom, we were just talking about work. I nodded, but something in my chest tightened. I started paying attention in ways I never had before. Not because I wanted to suspect them, but because I felt something shifting beneath the surface. My birthday came that year. They both came over. They brought a cake. They brought flowers. We took pictures. We laughed. But I noticed how often they checked their phones, how quickly they stood up to leave. After they drove away, I stood at the front door longer than usual. The driveway looked empty, too quiet. The house felt larger than it had ever felt. That night, I walked through each room slowly. I touched the dining table, the bookshelf, the picture frames on the wall. Memories lived in every corner. I had never thought of this house as something that could be handled, or downsized, or managed. It was home, but I began to understand that to them, it might look different. It might look like property. An asset, a responsibility, and maybe an opportunity. The idea hurt me more than I expected, not because of money, but because of meaning. I did not care about the value of the house. I cared about what it held. I began sleeping less at night. My mind replayed conversations, small words, small pauses. Were they worried about me? Or were they worried about something else? One evening, my daughter came by again. She brought dinner. We sat together quietly. Halfway through the meal, she said, Mom, if something ever happened to you, would you want us to sell the house? There it was again, that quiet focus on if something happened. I set my fork down. I haven't thought about it, I answered honestly. She looked at me carefully. It's just important to plan. She said, plan? That word again. I forced a gentle smile. I suppose you're right. But inside, something felt fragile. I started noticing how often they talked about the future without including me in it. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but as if I were already becoming a memory instead of a person. One afternoon, I overheard my son telling someone on the phone, she's still doing okay for now. For now, I stood in the hallway frozen. Still doing okay. As if I were a situation, a condition, something temporary. That was the first time I felt truly afraid. Not of illness, not of death, but of becoming invisible while I was still alive. I did not confront them. I did not accuse. I told myself I needed proof before allowing my heart to break. So I stayed quiet. I observed. I began organizing my documents myself. Bank statements, insurance papers, old files and drawers. If they wanted me to plan ahead, I would plan. But I would do it carefully, because somewhere deep inside me, a small voice was whispering that something was not right. I did not know what it was yet, only that the warmth I once felt so naturally now carried a thin layer of distance, and distance, when left alone, can grow slowly, quietly, until one day you find yourself lying in a hospital bed listening and realizing the change you sensed was real all along. The day I collapsed was not dramatic. There was no storm outside, no loud warning, no sharp pain that made me scream. It was an ordinary afternoon. I had just finished watering the plants in the backyard. The sun was soft. The air felt warm but gentle. I remember thinking how peaceful everything seemed. I went back inside. I washed my hands. I poured myself a glass of water. Then I felt it, a sudden heaviness in my chest. Not sharp, not stabbing, just heavy, like someone had quietly placed a weight on me. I sat down at the kitchen table. I told myself it would pass. It's nothing, I whispered, just tired. But the room began to spin slightly. The clock on the wall looked blurry. The sound of my own breathing grew louder in my ears. I tried to stand. My knees felt weak. The glass slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor. That sound, I still remember it clearly. Sharp, sudden, final. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could see the ceiling, but I could not move properly. I do not know how long I lay there. Minutes. Maybe. It felt longer. At some point, I must have lost consciousness. When I opened my eyes again, I saw a face above me. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. She looked frightened. Oh my goodness. Stay with me, she said. Her voice sounded far away. Later, I learned she had come over to return a dish I had lent her. She found the front door unlocked. She heard the broken glass. She found me on the floor. She called the ambulance immediately. I remember the sound of sirens, bright lights flashing through the window, strangers moving quickly around me. Can you hear me? One of them asked. I tried to nod. Everything felt slow, heavy. They lifted me onto a stretcher. The ceiling moved above me as they carried me out. I remember seeing my house from the outside, the door wide open, the ambulance lights reflecting off. The walls. It looked unfamiliar somehow. As if I were already leaving it behind. Inside the ambulance, they attached wires to my chest. They checked my pulse. They asked questions. Do you have family? Yes, I whispered. Have you been feeling pain? A little, I said. My voice felt weak. I heard one of them say, we need to notify her children. That sentence stayed with me. Notify her children. I asked if I had already crossed into something serious. The ride felt long. The hospital ceiling lights passed above me one by one. White, bright, cold. When we arrived, everything moved quickly. Doctors, nurses, machines. They placed me in a bed. They ran tests. Someone said my blood pressure was very low. Someone else mentioned possible heart issues. The words floated around me. I tried to focus on breathing. In, out. After some time, the room became quieter. The tests slowed. The urgency faded slightly. A nurse adjusted my blanket. You're stable for now, she said gently. For now, that phrase again. I closed my eyes. I felt tired in a way I had never felt before, not just physically, emotionally, as if something inside me had been shaken loose. Later, I heard footsteps rushing down the hallway. Familiar voices. My children. Where is she? My daughter asked urgently. In here, a nurse replied. The door opened. I kept my eyes half closed. I did not want to see their faces yet. I wanted to hear them first. They came close to the bed. Mom? My son said softly. I did not answer immediately. I wanted to understand their tone. Was it fear, concern, or something else? My daughter touched my hand. Her fingers felt cold. She's awake? She asked on and off. The nurse replied, we'll give you some time. The nurse left. The room felt smaller with them inside it. I opened my eyes slowly. They both leaned in, relief washed over their faces. "Oh, Mom," my daughter said. "You've scared us." I tried to smile. "I'm sorry," I whispered. My son shook his head. "Don't apologize." They stayed for a while. They asked the doctor questions. They nodded seriously. The doctor explained that I would need to stay overnight for observation. Maybe longer. "It could be stress," he said. "Or something cardiac. We'll monitor her closely." Monitor her closely. Everything sounded so careful, so clinical. That first night, they stayed until visiting hours ended. My daughter kissed my forehead. "We'll come back in the morning," she said. I nodded. After they left, the room felt very quiet. The machines made soft sounds. Beep. Pause. Beep. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Part of me felt grateful. They came quickly. They looked worried, but another part of me felt uneasy. I remembered the recent conversations, the questions about the house, the planning. Was I imagining things? Or was something beneath their concern? The next morning, they returned together. They brought flowers, bright ones. They placed them near the window. My daughter spoke gently. My son asked about the tests, but there were moments when they stepped into the hallway to talk, their voices lowered, whispers. I could not hear the words clearly, only the tone, serious, focused. Once I heard my son say, "We should think ahead." Think ahead. Again. Later that day, a social worker came into the room. She spoke kindly. She asked about my living situation, about whether I lived alone. "Yes," I answered. My daughter quickly added, "But we check on her often." The social worker nodded. "After a health event like this," she said gently, "it's important to consider support systems." Support systems. My children exchanged a look. I noticed that it was quick, but it was there. That evening, my son sat beside my bed. He seemed thoughtful. "Mom," he began slowly, "maybe after this, we should make some changes." Changes. I felt my chest tighten again. "What kind of changes?" I asked softly. "Just making things easier for everyone." "For everyone, not just for me." I nodded weakly. "I'll think about it," I said. He squeezed my hand. "You need to rest," he replied. Rest. That word felt heavy. As if rest meant stepping aside. As if rest meant letting others decide. That night, as I lay in the hospital bed, I stared at the dim light above me. I thought about my house, my garden, the kitchen table. I thought about how quickly things can shift. One moment you are standing in your own home, the next moment you are lying under hospital lights, while other people begin discussing changes. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. They were my children. They loved me. They were probably just scared. But somewhere deep inside me, a quiet fear began to grow. Not fear of illness, but fear of becoming powerless. The next morning would bring more tests, more conversations, more whispers in the hallway, and soon, the whisper I was never meant to hear. The third morning in the hospital felt different. The air in the room felt heavier, not because of my condition, but because of the conversations that were beginning to form around me. The doctor said my heart was stable, my blood pressure had improved. They wanted to keep me for a few more days. Just to be safe, he said. Just to be safe. I nodded. I was too tired to argue. My children arrived shortly after breakfast. They looked serious, focused. They were not carrying flowers this time. They were carrying a folder, a thin gray folder. I noticed it immediately. My son held it under his arm. My daughter sat closer to the bed than usual. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" she asked gently. "Better," I replied. "A little stronger." That was true, but I also felt something else, a quiet alertness, like my heart had decided to wake up fully. My son pulled the chair closer. "We've been thinking," he began slowly. That phrase again. "We've been thinking." I stayed quiet. He opened the gray folder. Papers slid slightly against each other. We spoke to someone about making things easier for you, he continued. Easier? I asked. Yes, just in case something like this happens again. Just in case. He took out a document. It's a power of attorney form, he said carefully. It would let one of us handle bills, medical decisions, things like that, if you're ever unable to. I looked at the paper. The words felt distant. Power, authority, unable. I'm still able, I said softly. Of course you are, my daughter said quickly. This is just a precaution. Precaution. Everything was a precaution lately. My son leaned forward. Mom, we just want to protect you. Protect me. I studied their faces. They looked sincere, but there was urgency there too. A quiet push. I've managed my bills for years, I said gently. I've handled my own decisions, yes, my son replied. And you've done an amazing job. But this is about the future. The future. The room grew quiet. I could hear the faint beeping of the monitor. Beep, pause, beep. My daughter reached for my hand. We just want to avoid complications later, she said softly. Complications for who? The question formed in my mind, but I did not say it out loud. Instead, I asked, who would have this power? They exchanged a glance. I was thinking I could. My son answered, of course. He handled numbers well. He always had. I live closer, my daughter added gently, so I could help too. Double quotes help. It all sounded helpful, reasonable, responsible, but something inside me felt unsettled. Not angry, just aware. Can I think about it? I asked quietly. There was a pause. Yes, my son said after a moment. Of course. But I sensed disappointment in his voice. They had expected me to sign. Right there. Right then. Later that afternoon, I pretended to nap. They thought I was asleep. Their voices lowered. I told you we should have brought the notary, my daughter whispered. She needs time, my son replied. If we push too hard, she'll resist. Resist. The word struck me like cold water. Resist what? A simple precaution? Or something more? I kept my breathing slow and steady. I did not move. She won't be able to manage that house much longer, my daughter continued. The maintenance alone. We can't wait until it becomes a mess, my son said quietly. Wait. There it was again. Waiting. The same word I would hear later in the most painful way. I felt my chest tighten. But I forced myself to stay still. They were not speaking cruelly. They were not mocking me. They sounded practical. Organized. As if they were discussing a project, not their mother. That evening, after they left, I asked a nurse for my phone. She handed it to me with a smile. Need to call someone? She asked kindly. Yes, I said. I scrolled slowly through my contacts. My fingers trembled slightly. I stopped at one name. Mr. Daniels, my lawyer. I had met him years ago when I first wrote my will. I hesitated for a moment. Then I pressed call. He answered on the third ring. Hello. It's me, I said softly. He recognized my voice immediately. Are you all right? He asked with concern. I'm in the hospital, I admitted, but I'll be fine. I paused. I need to review my documents. There was silence on the other end. Of course, he replied calmly. We can arrange that. I don't want anyone else to know. I added gently. I understand, he said. That night, I slept lightly. Not from fear, but from clarity. Something had shifted inside me. Not anger, not betrayal. Awareness. The next day, my children returned again with the gray folder. We don't want to pressure you, my daughter began. But it's important. Important for whom? I listened quietly as they explained the benefits again. Simpler banking, quicker decisions, less stress for me. They were careful with their words. Very careful. I looked at my son. Why now? I asked softly. He seemed surprised by the question. Because this scare showed us how fragile things can be, he said. Fragile. Was I fragile? Perhaps, but I was still here, still thinking, still deciding. I need a few more days. I told them gently. Another pause. All right. He agreed. But I could feel the impatience just beneath the surface that afternoon. I watched them from under half-closed eyes as they stood near the window. They thought I was asleep again. She has to agree eventually, my daughter whispered. She will, my son answered. She trusts us. Trust. That word hurt the most. Because it was true. I had trusted them with everything. My heart, my sacrifices, my years, but trust should never feel like a tool. It should feel like warmth. That evening, Mr. Daniels came quietly to the hospital. He arrived alone, no folder in his hands, just a calm expression. We spoke softly while my children were gone. I'd like to make a few updates, I told him. He nodded without judgment. That is your right, he said gently. We reviewed everything, the house, the savings, the accounts. I made small changes, not out of revenge, but out of balance. I added a charity donation. I adjusted distributions. I created clear boundaries. I wanted fairness and dignity. When my children returned later that evening, they noticed nothing. They smiled. They asked about my appetite, but the folder remained on the chair beside them, waiting. And so was I, waiting to see how far their planning would go, waiting to understand whether this was love wrapped in fear, or something colder wrapped in politeness. I kept my eyes open more often now. I listened carefully, because I had begun to understand something important. Sometimes people speak most honestly when they think you cannot hear them, and very soon, they would whisper something that would change everything. That evening felt different from the others. The sky outside my hospital window was gray, not dark yet, but heavy. The room lights were dimmed. The hallway sounded quieter than usual. I felt tired, but my mind was clear. Clear in a way it had not been before. My children arrived together again. They stood near the foot of my bed at first, speaking softly to each other. I kept my eyes closed, not because I was asleep, but because I wanted to listen. There is a kind of truth that only appears in whispers, and that night, I was ready to hear it. My daughter adjusted the blanket near my feet. My son looked at the monitor beside me. She's resting, my daughter whispered. She looks weaker, my son replied quietly. Weaker. The word floated above me like smoke. I talked to the doctor earlier, he continued. He said recovery could take time. That might be better. My daughter said softly, better. Better for what? I kept my breathing slow, even, steady. Silence filled the room for a moment. Then I heard it, the sentence that would stay with me forever. After this, everything changes. My daughter's voice. Soft, certain. My heart did not race. It did not pound wildly. It simply sank. Everything changes. My son let out a slow breath. Yes, he replied, it has to. There was no anger in his voice, no cruelty. Just decision. I felt something inside me go very still. Not broken. Just still. What about the house? My daughter asked quietly. We'll put it on the market, he answered. It's too much for her now. Too much for her. I wanted to open my eyes. I wanted to sit up and say, I am still here. But I did not. Instead, I listened. If we sell it quickly, he continued, we can split everything and move forward. Split everything. Move forward. Forward without me. She won't be alone anymore, my daughter added. We can find a facility, somewhere comfortable. A facility. The word felt cold. Not home. Not family. A facility. My fingers twitched under the blanket, but I kept my body still. We just have to wait. My son said softly, wait. The same word again. Wait for what? For my recovery? Or for something else? I could hear papers shifting, the gray folder. They had brought it again. She trusts us, my daughter whispered. She won't fight it. Fight. The word cut deeper than the rest. Fight what? My own future? My own home. I felt the warmth of a tear slide from the corner of my eye into my hairline, but my eyes remained closed. They did not notice. She gave us everything, my daughter said after a pause. Her voice trembled slightly. Yes, my son agreed, and we're just trying to manage it properly. Manage it. Was I now something to manage? A responsibility. An asset. A transition. The beeping of the monitor filled the silence between their words. Beep. Pause. Beep. I remembered birthday candles, school, plays, late night talks at the kitchen table. I remembered holding their hands when they were afraid. I remembered telling them, "You'll always have a home here." And now, my home was being discussed like paperwork. She won't be able to live alone after this. My daughter continued. We can't risk it. Risk. Everything had become a risk. I wanted to ask them something. Just one question. Did you ever think to ask me what I wanted? But I stayed silent, because in that silence, I learned more than I ever could through confrontation. My son moved closer to the bed. He adjusted the four-line gently. She looks peaceful, he murmured. Peaceful. I was not peaceful. I was awake in a way I had never been. She deserves comfort, my daughter said. Yes, he agreed. And we deserve to move on too. There it was. The quiet truth. Move on. The words were not cruel. They were not harsh. They were spoken softly, but they carried weight. A weight heavier than the one I felt in my chest the day I collapsed. I understood something in that moment. They were not wishing me harm. They were not hoping for my end. They were simply preparing for life without me. Preparing in advance. Planning ahead. I had become part of their future strategy. Not their present love. Another long silence filled the room. I feel bad, my daughter whispered. Don't. My son replied. This is what's practical. Practical. Love had turned practical. I lay there, still as stone, and something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not rage. Just clarity. Clear and steady. I realized that the greatest pain was not the thought of leaving this world. It was the realization that I had already begun to fade from theirs, and they were adjusting comfortably, planning carefully, organizing quietly. The door creaked slightly as someone passed in the hallway. They lowered their voices further. If we wait too long, my son said softly, it will get complicated. Complicated. I almost smiled at that word. Life is complicated. Love is complicated. But somehow, I had become the complication. After a while, my daughter stood up. We should go, she whispered. She needs rest. Yes. I needed rest from the conversation, from the illusion. My son leaned close to my face. I love you, Mom, he said quietly. His voice sounded sincere, and that is what hurt the most, because he did love me. In his way, but love without listening becomes control. Love without presence becomes planning. I felt his hand squeeze mine gently. Then their footsteps moved toward the door. The door opened. Closed. Silence returned to the room. Real silence this time. I opened my eyes slowly. The ceiling above me looked the same. White. Still. But I felt different. Not fragile. Not confused. Awake. Truly awake. I turned my head slightly toward the window. The sky had darkened fully now. Night had arrived quietly, just like their decision. I let another tear fall. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just softly. I whispered into the empty room. I am still here. The machines continued their steady rhythm. Beep. Pause. Beep. I thought about the house, the garden, the table. They thought everything would change after this. And they were right. Everything would change. But not in the way they expected. Because while they were planning my future, I was quietly reclaiming it. and from that moment on, I would never pretend to sleep again. The morning after the whisper, I felt different, not weaker, not defeated. Clear. The kind of clear that comes after a long night of thinking. The nurse came in early. She checked my vitals. She smiled and said, "You're improving." I nodded. Yes, I was improving. In more ways than she knew. When my children arrived later that morning, I was sitting up in bed. I made sure of that. I did not want them to see me lying there with my eyes closed. I wanted them to see me awake. "Oh, you look better," my daughter said with relief. "I feel better," I answered gently. That was true. Because now I understood something important. They thought they were planning my future. But what they did not know was that I had already started planning my own. Months before the hospital. Months before the gray folder. Months before the whisper. The truth is, I had sensed the distance long ago, not clearly, not sharply, but softly. Like a curtain moving in a room with no visible wind, I could not explain it. But I felt it. The shorter visits, the practical conversations, the careful tone when money was mentioned. I told myself I was imagining it, but I was not. And because I am not foolish, I had taken quiet steps. Last year, after my daughter first mentioned downsizing, I made an appointment with Mr. Daniels. I did not tell anyone. I took a taxi downtown. I sat in his office. I folded my hands in my lap. "I just want to review everything," I told him calmly. He nodded. He had seen this before: aging parents, shifting family dynamics. He did not judge. We reviewed my will, my house, my savings. Everything was originally divided evenly between my two children. That had always been my plan. Simple, fair. But fairness is not always equality. Fairness also considers behavior. Respect. Care. At that time, I did not change much. I simply asked questions. What happens if I become unable to decide? What protections do I have? What rights remain mine? Mr. Daniels explained everything patiently, and I listened carefully. When I left his office that day, I felt calmer, not suspicious, prepared. Then, 3 months ago, something small happened. My son called me about the house insurance. He asked for details, policy numbers, renewal dates. It sounded normal, but his tone was focused, interested, too interested. That night, I sat at my dining table alone, the same table where I had packed lunches years ago. I stared at the wood grain beneath my fingers, and I made a decision. Not out of fear, not out of anger, out of dignity. I scheduled another meeting with Mr. Daniels. This time, I made adjustments. I added a clause stating that I would remain in my home for as long as I wished. And no forced sale. No relocation without my written approval. I added a portion of my savings to a small local charity that supports elderly women living alone, women like me. I adjusted the inheritance percentages slightly, not dramatically, just enough to reflect effort and presence. My daughter had been distant. My son had been practical. Neither had been cruel. But neither had truly asked, "Mom, what do you want?" So I made sure my documents answered that question clearly. I did not tell them, because I did not want conflict. I wanted quiet protection. Now, lying in the hospital after hearing their whisper, I felt grateful for my past self. Grateful that she had trusted her instincts. Grateful that she had acted before the storm arrived. That afternoon, while my children stepped out for coffee, I asked the nurse for my phone again. I called Mr. Daniels. "I'd like to confirm everything," I said softly. He understood immediately. "Nothing has changed," he reassured me. "Good," I replied. My voice was steady, because I was steady. When my children returned, I observed them differently, not as a fragile mother seeking comfort, but as a woman assessing truth. My son sat by the window. He looked thoughtful. "We should talk to the social worker again," he said quietly to my daughter. About long-term options. Long-term options. I watched them. I did not interrupt. My daughter nodded slowly. She won't be able to manage stairs after this, she added. Stairs? My house only had 3 steps at the entrance. 3 steps I had climbed for 30 years. Suddenly, those steps were mountains in their minds. I cleared my throat gently. They both turned to me quickly. You're awake, my daughter said. Yes, I answered calmly. I've been awake for a while. There was something in my tone that made them pause. Not accusation, just awareness. My son smiled carefully. That's good, Mom. You need your strength. I nodded. And I have it, I replied softly. They seemed unsure how to respond. For the first time, I felt the balance shift slightly. Not in my favor, but toward equality. That evening, I asked for a notebook. The nurse brought one, a simple blue cover. I began writing. Not dramatic things, just lists. What I wanted, where I felt strongest, what brought me peace, my garden, my kitchen table, my morning tea by the window. I wrote one sentence clearly in the center of the page. I am not finished living. I underlined it once, slowly. The next day, the doctor said I could likely go home within a week. My children looked surprised. So soon? My son asked. Yes, the doctor confirmed. She's responding well. I watched their expressions carefully. Relief was there, but also adjustment. Their timeline had shifted. That night, as I lay awake, I replayed the whisper again in my mind. After this, everything changes. They were right. Everything had changed, but not because I was weak, because I was awake. What they did not know was that I had already secured my home, my choices, my dignity. They thought the gray folder held power, but the real power was mine. Signed quietly months ago, protected legally, and strengthened emotionally the moment I heard them plan without me. I did not hate them. That is important to say. I did not wish them harm. I did not want revenge. I simply wanted respect, and if respect could not be requested, it would be established. When I finally closed my eyes that night, I did not pretend to sleep. I slept peacefully, because for the first time since entering that hospital, I knew something clearly. And no matter what they whispered next, my future would not be decided in a hallway. It would be decided by me. The day I was discharged from the hospital was bright and quiet. Sunlight came through the window, soft, almost gentle. The doctor smiled as he signed the final papers. You've made good progress, he said, but take it slow. Take it slow. I nodded. I had no intention of rushing anything. My children stood on either side of my bed while the nurse removed the last wires. They looked relieved. My daughter adjusted my cardigan carefully. My son held my handbag. They were attentive, kind, almost overly careful. I could see it clearly now. They were managing the situation, but I was managing something too. The drive home was quiet. I sat in the back seat, watching the streets pass by, shops, trees, people walking with groceries. Life had continued while I lay in that hospital bed, and now I was returning to it. When we pulled into my driveway, I felt something tighten in my chest, not pain. Emotion. My house stood exactly as I had left it, the curtains slightly open, the garden a little overgrown, but it was still mine. My son helped me out of the car. Be careful, he said gently. I will, I answered. The 3 steps at the entrance felt steady beneath my feet, not mountains, just steps. Inside, the air smelled familiar. Wood, tea leaves, home. My daughter walked through each room quickly. Everything looks fine, she said. Fine. Yes. It was more than fine. It was my life. They insisted on staying the first evening. They ordered food. They moved around the kitchen as if it were fragile. I sat at the table and watched. For the first time, I did not feel small in my own house. I felt observant, aware. After dinner, my son brought up the topic gently. We should still talk about long-term plans, he said carefully. Long-term plans. I took a slow sip of tea before answering. We will, I replied calmly, but not tonight. There was firmness in my voice. Not anger, just clarity. They exchanged a glance, but neither argued. That night, after they left, I walked slowly through each room. I touched the walls, the door frames, the bookshelf. I stood in the living room and looked at the couch where my husband used to sit. I'm still here, I whispered softly. The house felt steady around me. The next morning, I woke early. Habit. I made my own tea. I opened the curtains fully. Sunlight filled the kitchen. I sat at the table with my blue notebook. And I made decisions. Not emotional ones. Practical ones. But chosen by me. First, I called Mr. Daniels. I'm home, I told him. That's good to hear. He replied warmly. I'd like copies of all the updated documents, I added. Of course. He said. Next, I called a real estate agent. Not because I was ready to sell, but because I wanted information. Knowledge is calm, ignorance creates fear. The agent came 2 days later. She walked through the house carefully. She complimented the garden. She mentioned the market value. The number surprised me. It was higher than I expected. I listened quietly. I did not commit to anything. But I understood something clearly. If this house were ever sold, it would be because I chose to sell it, not because someone whispered in a hallway. My daughter visited that weekend. She brought soup. She looked around the living room thoughtfully. You know, she began gently, if you ever decide to move, we could find somewhere closer to me, closer to her. I smiled softly. That's kind of you, I said, but I'm not planning to move right now. She paused. You're sure? Yes, I answered calmly. Very sure. There was something in my tone that made her sit back. She studied me for a moment. You seem different, she said quietly. Do I? I replied gently. She nodded. Stronger. I almost laughed. Stronger. I had been strong for years. But now, I was visible in my strength. My son called later that week. How are you managing? He asked. I'm doing well, I said. You're not overexerting yourself? No, a short pause followed. About the power of attorney, he began. I interrupted him gently. I've reviewed everything, I said calmly. My documents are updated. Silence. You updated them? He asked carefully. Yes. Another pause. With Mr. Daniels? Yes. His voice changed slightly. Not angry. Just surprised. Oh, he said. I didn't know. I didn't think you needed to, I replied softly. The line stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then he cleared his throat. Well, that's good, as long as everything's organized. Organized. Yes. Everything was organized, including my boundaries. Over the next few weeks, I made small changes in my life. I hired a gardener to help once a month. I arranged automatic bill payments. Myself, I joined a local senior walking group. Not because I needed supervision, but because I wanted companionship. Choice feels very different from control. When my children visited, I welcomed them warmly. I did not confront them about the whisper. I did not accuse, because sometimes understanding is more powerful than argument. One evening, my daughter sat at the table quietly. Mom, she said softly, I hope you know we just want what's best. I looked at her carefully. I know, I replied, and I meant it. They believed they were being responsible. They believed they were being practical. But practicality without conversation can feel like erasure. I did not want to erase them from my life, and I would not allow myself to be erased from theirs. A month after leaving the hospital, I invited them both over for dinner. I cooked slowly, carefully. The table was set the way it used to be years ago, candles lit softly. When they arrived, they looked almost surprised. You did all this? My son asked. Yes. I smiled. I'm still capable. We ate quietly at first, then I spoke. Not harshly, not dramatically. I need you both to understand something. I said gently. They looked up at me. I appreciate your concern. I do. But my life is not a project. It's still mine. Silence filled the table. My daughter's eyes softened. My son looked down at his plate. I'm not finished living, I continued calmly, and I will decide when things change. No one argued. And no one raised their voice, but something shifted. In that room, not tension. Respect. It was subtle, but real. That night, after they left, I stood by the window again. The garden moved gently in the evening breeze. I thought about the hospital room, the whisper. After this, everything changes. They were right. Everything had changed. But not because I became weaker, because I chose to become visible, because I chose to wake up fully, and because I remembered something important. A mother can love deeply, but she must also protect her dignity, and now I was awake. The days that followed felt lighter, not because the world had changed, but because I had. I woke up each morning with a quiet sense of purpose. I poured my tea carefully, watched the sunlight spill across my kitchen table, heard the birds outside. The little things felt precious now. I realized something important. Life is not about avoiding collapse or about pretending to sleep when danger or change comes. It's about standing quietly in your own truth. I still saw my children often. They visited on weekends. Sometimes they stayed for dinner. We laughed softly. We shared stories from years ago. I told them about my garden. They told me about their jobs and small victories. But the difference was clear. I listened more carefully. They listened more carefully. And no more whispers behind closed doors. And no more quiet plotting in the hallway. We had found balance. I allowed myself to reflect on the hospital visit often. At first, it hurt. The whisper, the quiet planning, the gray folder. It felt like betrayal. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood. My children did not act out of cruelty. They acted out of fear. Fear of losing me. Fear of responsibility. Fear of change. And fear often disguises itself as control. I forgave them quietly. Not because they apologized. Not because they even knew they needed forgiveness. But because forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves. I stopped pretending to be powerless. Stopped pretending to sleep through life. Stopped allowing concern and care to be confused with control. I made a routine for myself. I tended the garden. I cooked my meals. I read books I had long put aside. I began walking in the neighborhood every morning. People greeted me. Neighbors smiled. And I smiled back. I felt stronger. More awake than I had in years. One afternoon, I called my oldest friend. We spoke for hours. I told her everything: the hospital, the whisper, the gray folder. She listened quietly, and she said something simple but profound. You're still you. That's what matters. Yes, that is what mattered. I began journaling every evening. Not long entries, just thoughts, small moments of gratitude, small victories, small realizations. I wrote about the whisper. I wrote about how it had shaken me and how it had awakened me. I wrote about my children, how they loved me, how they were human, and how I was finally seeing that love clearly. Some days, I reread the documents I had signed quietly months before the hospital. I felt a quiet smile spread across my face. Dignity had been preserved, choices had been kept, and I had done it without confrontation, without resentment, without drama. It was a quiet victory. The house remained mine. The garden remained mine. The table where I had poured so many cups of tea remained mine. And it felt good. There were moments of reflection that felt tender and bittersweet. Sometimes I would see my son looking at me, and I would remember the whisper. After this, everything changes. And I would smile quietly. Yes, everything had changed, but in the way I wanted it to. I had not become smaller. I had not been erased. I had become aware, present, steady. The hospital had not taken my life. It had given me clarity. The whisper had not broken me. It had awakened me. I thought often about love. How love is quiet. How love sometimes masks itself as control. But the truest love is patient. It allows space. It respects choice. It does not rush. And it does not pretend someone is weaker than they are. I could see my children in this new light. Not as people plotting against me, but as people learning how to love imperfectly. And I could see myself in a new light too. Not as fragile, not as dependent, but as capable. As worthy. As awake. In the weeks that followed, I resumed small joys, morning tea by the window, reading letters from old friends, tending to the flowers I had planted decades ago. Every day felt meaningful, not because it was extraordinary, but because I had reclaimed it. I also began speaking softly to neighbors and friends about aging gracefully, about maintaining independence, about protecting dignity without confrontation. Some listened, some nodded quietly, and some thanked me for sharing. It felt good to help others see what I had learned, that life is fragile, but dignity is strong, and awareness is powerful. On quiet evenings, I would sit on my porch, watching the sky change from gold to pink to deep blue. I would think about the whisper one last time, the words that had struck fear in me, and I would smile softly because I had learned the most important lesson of all. Life can change in an instant. People can act without realizing the impact of their words, but your presence, your choices, your awareness, that cannot be taken unless you allow it. I had allowed myself to be awake. To see clearly. To protect what mattered most. And in doing so, I found peace, a quiet peace. Not the absence of challenges, not the absence of whispers, but the presence of self, the presence of choice, the presence of love that is patient, respectful, and steady. And as the sun set on that first full month after the hospital, I whispered to myself softly, I am still here. I always was, and I always will be.